So this is going to be part 2 of something I'm going to title like Bolt Action University. Understanding rifles, specifically bolt actions, but some of this will apply obviously to other actions. To go off on a short tangent, one of the reasons I like podcasts is because they can be long form, kind of like audiobooks. You know, not just a YouTube short where, oh, watch me shoot this watermelon or look at this tiny little group that a rifle can shoot, but getting into the nitty gritty. One of the things we're going to start off today is where the rubber meets the road on triggers. 2-stage, single stage, flat triggers, curved triggers, pre-travel, post-travel, all kinds of stuff. And that's just triggers. We're going to talk about other stuff today. This is part 2. If you haven't listened to part 1, you may want to go back and give that a listen. Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting tactics, ballistics, rifles, pistols, shotguns, the right way, with God at the center, biblical, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Bio bullet points in the show notes, but to establish some bona fides of things God's blessed me to do so I can pass knowledge on to you. Won my first gold medal in rifle before I joined the Marine Corps at 17, was a state champion rifle shooter, was an expert rifleman in the Marine Corps, West Coast regional rifle champion at some point after that, all the way from, you know, the border of Mexico all the way up to Alaska and over as far as, I forget, Montana, wherever the cutoff was for that region. Didn't get to go to nationals that year because the Army had other plans for me. I served in the Army after the Marine Corps, infantry, and both. I've done a lot of competition shooting. I've been blessed to do a lot of hunting, from growing up in the South hunting to living in the greater Yellowstone area, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, doing a lot of hunting there, guiding. Quite a bit of experience with rifles. And I hope to use that to help you guys out and break this down Barney style so it makes sense. Let's talk about where the rubber meets the road. Let's talk about triggers. Triggers are really where the rubber meets the road. Everybody talks about, well, not everybody, but a lot of people, the Instagram thing or the thing to post. I don't have Instagram. The thing to post is, I've got a 1 MOA gun. I've got a half MOA gun. Okay, you have that gun. That doesn't mean that you can do that unless you're talking about off a bench, off a rest, off a tripod or something, which is not super practical. Just whatever you see on influencers or whatever, that's just not super practical in the real world. The triggers where the rubber meets the road for you, let me put it this way. If I have a half MOA gun, which is a lot more rare than people would have you believe. Let's say I have a true half MOA gun. Any given day with the right ammo, I can go out and shoot a half MOA, a half inch at 100 yards. Every day, not just like cherry picking. I shot one group that's half MO, but like any day I go out with a properly, clean and then fouled barrel and all the other stuff, I can shoot a half MOA. It's an honest half MOA gun. I can shoot group after group, half MOA. Okay, let's say you have that. Let's say that gun has a 1.5 pound trigger. It's a half MOA gun. Let's say I take that gun out, assuming I don't mess with the bedding or anything in the gun, and I install a completely different trigger. Let's say it's a drop-in trigger unit, and I put in a 20-pound trigger, which you could probably make. Probably they'll mandate, well, I shouldn't say that, but places like New York for things mandate one of those places mandates like a crazy heavy trigger in some guns. But let's say you put in a 20-pound trigger. You give it like a trigger that would make a Glock trigger look good. And you put that trigger in that gun, and you put it in a vise. And you put it on exactly the same rest, unless you clamp it down in a lead sled. Again, super impractical, but that's how a lot of people like to shoot groups. That gun's still a half MOA gun, but you take that gun off a giant lead sled, and you're probably not shooting a half inch with it, right? I don't know a man that can shoot a decently weighted rifle with a 20-pound trigger half MOA, unless it would be off a bench or a vise or something. So the trigger is super important for you hitting the target. Not so much for rifle accuracy. The rifle accuracy shouldn't really change with the trigger, but your ability to hit a target, which is the entire reason you're shooting a rifle, unless it is just to shoot a tiny group, is for you to hit a target in a certain situation. Your interface with that rifle is super important, that trigger interface. There are many fundamentals of marksmanship: stance, grip, sight alignment, sight picture, trigger control, breath control, follow through, right? But trigger control is a giant one in here. Let's take a couple of examples here. One of the guns I like to pick on, like the hashtag, I call it the hashtag #MeToo gun. It's like, oh, I have a gun too. The Ruger LCP. I don't know what a Ruger LCP is. I'm not going to look it up for weight, but let's just say in my head it weighs like 9-10 ounces. Well, it's probably got a 5 or more pound trigger. So if we do 16 ounces per pound, that's 80 ounces. You're trying to move a 80-ounce trigger linearly without moving the gun at all, and the gun weighs 10 ounces. Not great. It's one of the reasons I am a big advocate of carrying a full-size fighting handgun. Let's take something way different than that. Let's say you get a target rifle, what I would consider a heavy target rifle, a 12-pound rifle, like a bull-barreled, still practical, but a heavy rifle, like a belly gun, meant to be shot off the prone, which is only practical in a very niche application. But let's just go there. A 12-pound rifle with a 1.5 pound trigger. You get the difference there. It's a lot easier to hold that gun steady through the firing cycle and manipulation of that trigger with that heavier gun and the lighter poundage and a cleaner trigger. You get it, right? It's a lot easier to do. That just illustrates the point that triggers are super important. But you have to be practical. Again, unless it's a not practical gun, a gun meant to be shot off a bench, in which case it doesn't really matter because it's not practical in the first place. But go back to that LCP, you would not want a 1.5 pound trigger on your LCP, especially if you do what I call wiener carry, which I'm not a big fan of, where you carry it pointed at your genitals. Right? You probably don't want a 1.5 pound, super light, super crisp, no pre-travel, no take-up, one stage, single stage, 1.5 pound trigger on your LCP that you have pointed at your genitals. You probably don't want that. It's not practical. Just like you probably don't want that Ruger LCP crazy long, crazy heavy trigger on your target gun, because the whole idea is to be accurate at distance. So the appropriate practical trigger to the weapon at hand. Now, getting more specific to bolt-action rifles and triggers, unless you're talking about a crazy target rifle, you're generally going to be talking about between a 1.5 pound to 3.5 pounds. Some of the older legacy rifles, could have a heavier trigger than that. But really, that's kind of the sweet spot in my opinion. You're going to want, 1.5 pound to 3.5 pound trigger on your rifle. That's kind of a sweet spot where, with really cold hands or gloved hands, you're not going to set the rifle off prematurely. It could still happen, but it's less likely that if somehow the safety gets knocked off, it's going to just go off if you're dragging it around, pulling it up out of your canoe or going through brush, whatever it is. But a practical way to trigger that'll still let you shoot it well. To give you an idea, I compete in CMP service rifle high power competitions. They dictate you have to have a 4.5 pound trigger there because most military guns, they would rather have more safety than more accuracy. And so when you're competing in a military service rifle competition, it's a minimum 4.5 pound trigger, which is pretty heavy. But again, what's practical? You're in the infantry, you're spending a lot more time carrying that rifle around and around a lot of other people than you are actually shooting the rifle. You're living with that rifle. You're sleeping with that rifle. You're eating with that rifle. You're living with that rifle. And the safety is more important to them than the accuracy. Although even with an old beat-up, crappy M16A2 with iron sights, you can hit a man-sized silhouette out to 550 yards, 500 meters. But it's harder with that heavy, nasty trigger. But let's take a modern bolt rifle in the 1.5 to 3 pound trigger. There's a lot of variance in there, even with that, because the poundage is probably one of the less important things. As long as you don't go to like the ridiculous. But let's start with stages. You have 2-stage and you have single stage. You have single stage and double stage triggers. A single stage trigger would be you put your finger on the trigger, you depress the trigger smoothly, linearly, the way you're supposed to, trigger control, and the trigger just breaks at some point. Hopefully a clean, glass rod type break. It's one stage. It's clean. Like you put your finger on the trigger and picture like a glass rod. You just continue to put pressure on that glass rod, and then it breaks. If you want to use a similar visual, not as good, but a two-stage trigger would be like a semi-cooked carrot. Like you figure you're holding a carrot between your fingers on one hand and you put your trigger finger on the carrot, baby carrot, in the other hand, and you pull that carrot back. It's going to move, get heavy, and then break. That's a two-stage trigger. Now, on a good two-stage trigger, it will be a lot better than a carrot, but that's a good analogy. You the way I've heard it in like practical rifle, like tactical rifle classes I've attended is bend the carrot, break the carrot, or something like that. So you are going to take up the first stage of that trigger. The first stage of that trigger, let's say it's to make easy math, let's say it's a 3-pound trigger. Let's just say for easy math, it's 1.5 pounds on the first stage and then 1.5 pounds on the second stage. Why would you want that? Well, in a tactical situation moving around, you may have your finger on the trigger. You may have multiple targets and you may not want to take your finger completely off the trigger. So in that case, you would have your finger on the trigger and you would have that pre-travel set or that first stage taken up. You would have that first stage, and that way when the target presented itself, because in tactical situations you often don't get to dictate when you get to shoot, the target dictates that. So you would have that taken up in the first stage, and then the second stage would only be 1.5 pounds, although the total would be 3 pounds. That way it was safer if you're moving around with the rifle, less likely to have a negligent discharge than if you only had 1.5 pound trigger to start with. So that's the difference between a one-stage and a two-stage trigger, single-stage, double-stage trigger. They have advantages and disadvantages, just like we aforementioned in part 1. What are you trying to do? Is it strictly going to be shot off a bench? Then you probably want a single-stage. Is it going to be in a more tactical, dynamic environment? You may prefer a two-stage trigger. But they both have their advantages and disadvantages. Another one for this we're going to talk about is pre-travel and then post-travel. Pre-travel, this is only take a second here. Pre-travel, the distance before the trigger breaks and releases the hammer or firing pin. The post-travel is after the trigger breaks, the amount that it travels before it stops. Now you may think, I just want the minimum of both. Well, again, to be practical, if you're just shooting it off a bench or in a vise and you're never going to use it in the field, it doesn't really matter. You could have almost zero. You can't have zero, but you could have virtually zero pre and post travel and it would be fine. But in a dynamic environment, a tactical environment, you may want quite a bit of both. One for safety in the pre-travel so the gun doesn't just go off as soon as you put your finger on it when you're, pumped up full of adrenaline and your muscles are all tense and it's hard to, let's say, be super gentle in those kind of situations. And for post-travel, you may want quite a bit of post-travel. In fact, I prefer quite a bit of post-travel. I don't shoot to reset generally. I don't like it. I've learned that whole technique and try and drop it off in a porta potty and leave it because I think it's crap. Pistol rifle, I generally won't shoot to reset unless it's just a horrible trigger like a Glock. But you might want post-travel, the travel after the trigger breaks, if you're shooting in a dynamic, again, stressful field environment, because if you're hammering on that trigger and it doesn't have any post-travel, you're likely to influence that gun a lot more. If it has more post-travel, then you're less likely to move that gun off target if you're slamming on that trigger. And if, you're going fast and taking chances, shooting fast and dirty, that happens. So that's pre-travel and post-travel. Pre-travel before the trigger breaks, post-travel after the trigger breaks. Boom. And again, it's a trade-off. What are you trying to do? You're trying to shoot a tiny cloverleaf group off a bench, or are you trying to move around in a tactical environment? Or are you trying to have a safe, effective gun, rifle, bolt action you can have on a sling and swing around to get a good firing grip and get a good shot off and then repeat, or have your finger on the trigger and realize you have to change positions to drop to a kneeling position or something like that. You only want a trigger so light and so crisp for that. You can get too light and too crisp or not enough travel. Trigger dimension is also important. I like a flat trigger, although that's hard to find on a bolt-action rifle. You can get them, but I like a flat, wide trigger. You might like a curved trigger. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. Curved trigger, if the gun fits you well, you'll generally be more likely to put your finger in the same place, in the center of the curve every time. A flat trigger is more forgiving, again, if you're less precise about finger placement, in that if it's flat and wide and straight, you generally have more forgiveness on the area you can put your finger, and it will have less impact on where you're going to hit the target. But I'm going to be honest, the vast majority of this is just personal preference. Do you like a flat trigger? Do you like a curved trigger? I tend to prefer a flat trigger, but you do you. And last, we already touched on it a bit, but poundage. Poundage, I think, is way overemphasized. People are like, oh, what's the weight of the trigger? The weight of the trigger is a component, but it's not even the major component, unless, again, you get to the ridiculous. Obviously, I don't want that 20-pound trigger in a rifle. And I don't want an 8-ounce trigger in any kind of practical rifle. In a bench rest rifle, fine. But in a practical rifle, no. But if you stay in those general parameters, pound and a half to 3.5 pounds, the trigger weight is not even first on my list as to what's important in a trigger. But the trigger, again, is where the rubber meets the road, so don't overlook the trigger. You might see a rifle with a 1 MOA guarantee, but it's got a crap trigger. Well, you're probably not going to shoot it very accurately, no matter how accurate the gun is. Next, let's talk about safeties on bolt-action rifles. You've got several major designs. There'll be some weird oddball stuff out there. But some of the major ones are going to be the crossbolt safety. This will be the one, I know it's not a rifle, but it's on some other rifles. I believe the Remington 760 has the same one, but on a Remington 870. A lot of people out there that are into guns have shot a Remington 870. This is a classic example of a crossbolt safety. It's behind the trigger where the trigger guard kind of meets the receiver / stock, and it's just a bolt. And you push that bolt one way or another. Generally, they're set up for a right-handed shooter, so when you're going to the trigger, you can hit it with the side of your finger and make the gun go on fire. So you can walk around with the gun on safe, hit it with your finger when you're, about to put your finger on the trigger and the gun's on fire. And then you'd have to generally manually reach over much slower to go back to safe. This is your cross-bolt safety. You may see a similar style safety because of the litigious nature of the 1990s and the gun culture and the gun bans, but they even started putting these on lever action rifles with a hammer, but they would put them in some weird awkward position. But a cross-bolt safety is kind of that big bolt that moves one direction or the other. Now, one of the classic safeties is going to be a tang safety. You'll see these, again, not a rifle, but on like many of your classic double guns, over and under side-by-sides. It's a tang safety. It's on the tang, which most shotguns have, not all rifles have, but it'll have like a tang where historically a wood stock was mated to the metal of the receiver. But the tang safety, you'll often hear the older Ruger 77s referred to as tang safeties. The older ones had a tang safety like a fine sporting shotgun. And you'll see this on various other hunting rifles, a tang safety. One of the advantages of these are they're pretty ambidextrous or totally ambidextrous. Like it's in the center or usually in the center of the back of the stock where the bolt is. So you can hit it with either thumb, whether you're right-handed or left-handed. If you're used to them, like you shoot a lot of shotgun, this might be the most friendly for you. If you're used to shooting like traps, sporting clays, those kind of things with a double gun, obviously it's an easy transition for you. Although a little bit different because it's in a slightly different position, like a Mossberg 500 will have the same. Again, a shotgun, but you get the idea of the tang safety. You will see these on rifles. Now, a big rivalry, the 700 versus the Winchester Model 70. The 700 has a 2-position safety on, unless it's a left-handed gun, but on a general Remington 700, it's going to be on the slightly to the right of where that receiver meets the stock. And it's going to have a simple push lever. Back towards you is safe, and when you push it forward, that's fire, forward for fire on a Remington 700. So again, you're grabbing the rifle, you're going to the trigger, you can push it forward with your thumb, and then you can have the weapon on fire. It's faster to go to fire than to safe. This is generally, on a 700, it's going to be the 2-position safety. The thing with these are that you cannot lock the bolt down on any ones that I'm aware of. So even when it's on fire, you can manipulate the bolt. And you might think no big deal. And maybe for you it's no big deal. If you're hunting out of a tree stand or, something like that, probably not a big deal. But if you're going through thick, nasty brush or the gun's getting beat around, you can have that bolt catch on something and open and drop that round on the ground. You may not even notice it. So you're one round down, and then you go to grab your rifle to shoot something, and the bolt's open. And it might take you a minute to figure that out. Not a minute, but, in a life or death situation or a hunting scenario, a half a second can make the difference. So you may go grab your gun, and the bolt's already open because it didn't lock closed. Enter the Winchester Model 70 3-position safety. This safety is in roughly the same location, except it's on the bolt itself. And this has 3 positions. It has a completely forward and fire position. You can kind of have the same manipulation where you push it all the way forward with your thumb of your firing hand and it goes to fire. You can put it in the middle position, and in the middle position you can manipulate the bolt. So you could load and unload the gun while the weapon's on safe, and the bolt is free to move, but the gun will not fire. In the 3rd position, which the 2 position does not have, it will lock the bolt closed. So if you're going through real thick, nasty country, or the gun's going to be on your pack or on a sling and not in your hands, you can lock that bolt closed so that, and it doesn't really stick out at all. So you'd have to do something crazy to get the safety to come off on any kind of obstacle. But you have that bolt locked closed. So you have locked, closed, and safe. But and then you have the middle position, which is the bolt can be manipulated, but the gun is still on safe. And then you have fire, in which you can work the bolt and the gun will fire. On the 2 position, the Remington 700 style, you can have fire and safe, but the bolt will be able to be moved either way. Another one historically not seen on bolt actions, but is becoming more popular, something like a Sig Cross or any kind of chassis gun that kind of mimics the ergonomics of a AR-15 style rifle with like a vertical grip. You may see a thumb safety. Now, I honestly like these. I generally run full-size fighting handguns. I like to with a thumb safety. I know some thumb safeties are dumb. That's the consensus. Like, you'll never remember to take a safety off on a handgun if you need it. And then the same people that say that will run an AR-15 or will point to all the military guys that run AR-15s, AR-10s, whatever. And it seems to be the military has been using rifles with safeties for a long time. So I don't really understand that. I just think it's a lot of Glock fanboys. But I like the thumb safety on the side. I really like the Winchester Model 70 3-position safety for the reasons that I can lock the bolt closed. But if I'm being honest, it's more natural for me because I have so many years and so much experience running AR-15s. If I'm walking around stalking, still hunting with the Model 70 type safety, which I really enjoy, I will generally try and remember to have my thumb on the safety ready to be pushed forward so that I remember it. I've got so many reps with an AR-15 or whatever, it just doesn't even matter. Even if the rifle's slung and I go to rifle, it just automaticity. Without even thinking about it when I'm on target, that safety's off. I'm used to that. You may or may not be, but if an AR-15 is the only style rifle you've ever shot, kind of the same thing with the shotgun. If you're used to a double rifle and you're going to a rifle, you may want a tang safety. If you're used to an AR-15 and you're going to a bolt gun, you may really want that thumb safety. It is really intuitive, ergonomic. It's a really good system if you can get a gun that has it. Most traditional guns are not going to have that. But some of the newer guns, chassis guns, they will have that sweep down thumb safety. And if you're used to that on a handgun, or if you're used to that on a 1911 or any kind of gun with a thumb safety, a manual safety other than some weird ones like the Beretta, you'll be very familiar with this. Also, again, if you're mostly familiar with the AR-15s, AR-10s, SCAR 17s, you'll be familiar with this. But those are some of the big versions of safeties. And again, there's oddballs. Now, I could do an entire series of really nerdy stuff on barrels, barrel materials, barrel finishes, rifling cuts, cold hammer forge versus button versus whatever. I'm not going to do that on this. It will be a whole series, and it will probably be too nerdy. I will talk briefly about muzzle devices, though. historically, you just had your muzzle. And one word of caution here, we'll throw the tactical tip in the middle. It is very important that you protect the crown of your barrel. Clean your rifle in the direction the bullet travels, from the breech to the muzzle. Don't be shoving cleaning rods down the muzzle of your gun, especially cheap 3-piece cleaning rods or aluminum cleaning rods. That's just a bad idea. You're probably better off never cleaning your rifle. And also, don't do the thing that was done in days of yore where you put the rifle muzzle down, banging around on the dirty floor of a truck if you want accuracy in your rifle. Protect the crown of your rifle. But historically, you pretty much just had a flush crown on your rifle. It may behoove you to have a recessed crown. For the reasons we talked about protecting that muzzle, it can be more protected if you have a recessed crown. So that just means the crown is cut back further into the barrel so that you have some protection of the barrel itself before you get to where the rifling comes out of the gun. The bullet coming out of that completely concentric and even, with lands and grooves and everything being symmetrical, that's super important for accuracy. You want to protect that crown. So don't overlook that. So you have your recessed crown. You may have a different types of target crown. You may have a 45-degree crown. You may have an 11-degree crown. But generally a recessed target crown, 11 degrees, something like that, you may find that desirable. Different muzzle devices you may also find desirable. I like to run muzzle devices even on my bolt-action hunting guns, not because I'm trying to be uber tactical and hide my flash from the elk, but because I'm pretty hard on stuff, and I beat my guns into stuff. I drop my guns. I don't know how many times I dropped my hunting rifles this year in the course of hunting, up and down steep mountains, slippery snow, rain, slippery grass, pine needles, steep terrain. It happens, and they just kind of help protect that crown. So I like the flash hiders, muzzle brakes, things like that. One, they can do a little bit to control recoil, or a lot depending on the muzzle brake. Those are important for that, but my main reason is they protect the crown of the rifle. So that's the main reason I have them. I slam it into a tree or a rock or something, I'm not wondering, did I just ruin a gun? So I like them for that. But they also can help reduce recoil. And there are suppressors. If you want to make your gun ridiculously long, unwieldy, and go from very loud to loud, get a suppressor. If you want to drop $1,300 on, a metal tube that looks like a metal version of a toilet paper tube, so you can drop it on Instagram and look cool, get a suppressor. If you want to cut your barrel down and forego several hundred feet a second for the same caliber to have a can on it, then run a suppressor. I'm not a big fan of suppressors, if you couldn't tell. But they do make the gun, if it's a supersonic rifle, if it's a subsonic rifle, under 10-50 feet per second, then they can have some real advantages. If you're trying to, shoot clandestinely in the suburbs, okay. But for most practical stuff, I'm not a big fan. Call me crazy that I don't want to drop, a suppressor for the technology that it is should cost, $20, $40 for inflation. It's a metal tube with baffles. It's not rocket science. If it were legal, you could make one for about $20. If you want to spend $1,200 on that and throw it on Instagram to look cool, go ahead. And if it's a supersonic round, it's still going to be loud. It's still not going to be hearing safe. So you're going to do all that, add all that bulk, and wait to the end of your gun to go from very loud to loud. Congratulations. But they will almost certainly affect point of aim, point of impact. So your gun's not going to shoot the same place with suppressor on, suppressor off. They can work loose. That can be a thing. And they're definitely going to add length and weight and bulk to your gun. They can, however, sometimes aid in accuracy of your gun. So there is that, to be fair. But those are kind of muzzle devices for the end of your gun. And I got asked about this recently. I thought it was common knowledge. But you can put tape on the end of your barrel. You can tape up the end of your barrel to stop stuff from getting in there. Water, sand, grit, stuff like that. So you can do that. That is a thing. Electrical tape, duct tape, doesn't have to be rocket science. It's not, for practical accuracy, you wouldn't want to shoot a bench press match starting with tape on the end of your barrel. But for practical hunting accuracy, it's not really going to affect anything. So that is a thing you can do to help protect the muzzle, especially if you have an unprotected, let's call it classic style flush cut muzzle or very slightly recessed muzzle. You can do that. So hopefully that answered some more questions on bolt action rifles or rifles in general. I hope this was helpful. With that, let's go to the tactical verse of the day. It's going to come at you from Exodus here. Adonai, Adonai, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness and truth. And abundant in loving kindness and truth, showing mercy to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means leaving the guilty unpunished. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.